Hello, good evening. 4 men were charged today with what prosecutors called a plot to shoot and kill police on the streets of London. The men, who were all arrested over the past 2 weeks, are accused of having acquired a gun, a silencer and ammunition. But it's something even more sinister that's informing the latest debate. Claims that they had a copy of an Islamic State fatwa and their alleged sworn allegiance to the group that calls itself ISIS. Could such an oath amount to treason? The Foreign Secretary suggested in the Commons yesterday he thinks it might. But is a 14th century law not used since World War II the right way to deal with 21st century jihadists? Here's Chris Cook.
Today, 4 men have been accused of obtaining a gun, plotting a terrorist attack and swearing oaths to the extremist group that calls itself the Islamic State. They've been charged with planning terrorist acts or assisting others to do so. But Philip Hammond, the Foreign Secretary, yesterday seemed open to the idea of using a very different, much older legal option to prosecute people pledged to the so-called Islamic State.
We have had a discussion about the allegiance question. We've seen situations of people declaring that they have sworn personal allegiance to the so-called Islamic State, and that does raise questions about their loyalty and allegiance to this country, and raises, as my honourable friend rightly says, questions about whether offences of treason could have been committed.
Treason is a medieval offence, first passed into law in 1351 during the reign of Edward III. It's been amended lots of times since the Act was first passed, but it still forbids making war against the sovereign or abetting her enemies.
The offences that are being committed, especially beheading fellow British nationals on international television, is more than murder, and it's more than terrorism. And therefore I think the full force of our law in our country should apply, and treason is the most serious offence. When you look at ISIS, when you're talking about the establishment, effectively, of an Islamic caliphate to which people are swearing allegiance, and when they join they tear up their passports, I think you're crossing into the territory of William Joyce and Lord Haw during the war, when he broadcast to this nation from Germany.
The New York Times reports that the British cruiser Exeter has been run aground near Port Stanley on the east coast of the Falkland Islands.
Joyce was an Irish fascist who was hanged for treason in 1946. His offence was to broadcast English-language Nazi propaganda into Britain from Germany. But is treason, which would now carry a prison sentence, the right law?
Treason is an offence against Her Majesty the Queen, but the victims of Islamic State are much broader than that. They involve Britons, they involve the people of Syria and Iraq, and people of many other states. The United Nations is currently investigating the events in Syria to determine whether war crimes and crimes against humanity have been committed. So to a certain extent, I think that treason is inadequate to capture the scale of the atrocities. The government's own website describes the language in the Act as obsolete, and clearly to conduct prosecutions under an Act that's that old, which has a definition that is that broad, would need to be tested, and we don't really know what would happen when it was tested in court.
Islamic State's pretense of being a state makes its adherents particularly vulnerable to a charge of treason. Its followers swear allegiance to the banned organisation. Lots video themselves destroying their passports. But it is already an offence to be a member of a proscribed organisation like the so-called Islamic State. And perhaps it just dignifies that group if we don't treat it just like any other criminal organisation.
Well, that was Chris Cook, and we're joined now by the writer and journalist Douglas Murray, and from Manchester by Asim Qureshi, the research director at CAGE, an advocacy group which works on behalf of those imprisoned as part of the war on terror. Thank you both very much for joining us. And Douglas Murray, do you think the act of swearing allegiance to ISIS, is treason?
Well, there are a number of problems, aren't there? I mean, not least, as it was mentioned in your package, the fact that Islamic State calls itself an Islamic State, but it's not recognised as a state, and there's a problem of legitimising it if we decide that it is indeed a state. However, I think this debate comes at a very useful time. There has been a problem for some years now, which you can feel successive governments, and indeed different governments across the West, struggling with, which is what you do about this form of subversion, treason. It's something like that. Now, I would suggest that the legislation that is obviously obsolete needs to be looked at, because there is definitely a problem of a type of ideology, a radical Islamist ideology, in which people do have effectively an allegiance to something that is not their country. And what do we do with those people? What ought we to do with them? That is a serious question which needs looking at.
And why should it be treason? Let me go to Asim Qureshi. Surely you can see that any jihadists who swear allegiance to ISIS, whatever that body is, must be committing treason by the nature of it, aren't they?
Look, I think these things are extremely complicated, and using broad brush terms and rhetoric around who these people are and what they believe in, I think is actually quite disingenuous.
Well, no, it's not disingenuous, because that's what the Foreign Secretary is talking about. He's talking about re-establishing this age-old, antiquated law to fill a gap that there is at the moment.
No, I don't think there is a gap. I mean, look, we have some of the most disproportionate legislation, across the whole of Europe in terms of how we deal with the threats that there are to the UK. In fact, rather than saying we need more laws or to reinvent old laws, we actually need to go back to the old criminal justice system, the way that we used to do things, which was based on evidence. Now, if people are committing war crimes, then yes, crimes should be held accountable. But the very idea that somehow anybody who goes over to Syria or Iraq should automatically be assumed to be joining up with ISIS, and that somehow that they've, kind of betrayed the UK, I don't think that necessarily marries up.
Not automatically. I don't think anyone thinks that it should happen automatically.
Well, that's
but just very quickly, it's certainly not true to say that we have the most stringent or the most draconian or anything else laws.
But do we need treason as an extra law when we can cover it by looking at war crimes or murder? Why would you glorify
first of all, war
it
crimes is difficult. There's a particular issue in this country at the moment which you can feel politicians dancing around. Look at the one mentioned in your package about membership of prescribed organisations. My think tank's looked at this. We've had 3 occasions on which this legislation, which was brought in the 2000 Act, reinforced in the 2006 Act, it's only been used 3 times. It's a very weak piece of legislation, actually, which has a very small prison sentence associated with it. The problem is, and we saw it again the other week with the Theresa May, the Home Secretary's speech at the Conservative Party conference, where she was talking about, for instance, banning orders on people being allowed to speak in public. Now, a lot of us think that those are very illiberal and quite wrong measures to bring in. But there are already, it sort of sounds like that coming from politicians, because really what they're trying to grapple with is not the people who are actually, as it were, have actually killed somebody on the streets of Britain. It is what people are doing where they are trying to subvert and are actually willing to fight against this country.
I mean, there you have it, Asim Qureshi. These guys are going overseas, they are signing up to ISIS, they are burning their passports. What's wrong with this country turning round and saying, yes, that's treachery, you're not wanted here anymore, and that's the law that we will put on top of this crime?
Yeah, but I mean, the thing is that how does that help stop that flow from happening in the first place anyway? Look, the reality is the message that's been sent out by the UK government for the last 13 years of this war on terror is that we can do a whole range of things to you. We can imprison you in your own home.
Or maybe
we can take your passports away.
Maybe that we don't do enough.
Let me just finish, okay? Like, we can take your passports away. We can take your citizenship away. This is the message that keeps on coming up over and over again by successive Home Secretaries.
And Asim Qureshi's point is it hasn't worked for 13 years.
But that's
palpably nonsense. Palpably nonsense. At least one very major plot has been prevented most years by the police and security service in this country. We have seen many arrests, dozens and dozens of prosecutions in recent years of people found guilty in the British courts of crimes.
Of crimes?
Yes.
Exactly.
Exactly.
So why
and that's
then
the point.
do you need
then
to...
why do you need to use all of these tools and convince people that they don't...
I raise the point because Asim Qureshi very disingenuously tries to pretend that, as it were, he's against the particular law we're talking about tonight. He's not. He's against the previous laws that have successfully prosecuted people in this country.
Asim, we've run out of time. Let me give you the last word on this then. This is about trying to prevent a worse state of affairs than we are currently in.
And it's the counter-terrorism legislation that's resulted in that domestic policy in the UK is alienating and disenfranchising young Muslim men, which is the reason why they find comfort in the fact that they belong somewhere. If we make them feel like they belong here, that's nonsense. Because the thing is that if you speak to any of the people who are disenfranched on the streets of London, they say the same thing, which is about counter-terrorism policy and the way that impacts.
I'm so sorry we've run out of time. Thank you both very much indeed. Now, back in Bill Clinton's